It happened so suddenly that I still replay the moment in my mind, wondering if I imagined it. I was standing in my own kitchen when the words hit me like a blow I never saw coming. My son looked me in the eye, arms crossed with that dismissive air, and told me he had sold something that wasn't his to take. Something that wasn't just an object, but the last living piece of the man I loved for more than 4 decades. The sound of those words sank into me slowly, almost metallic, bitter, like pennies dissolving on my tongue. My hands were still damp from the dishes, and I remember how the water dripped down my wrists as I clutched my coffee cup so tightly it rattled in its saucer. He didn't seem to notice the way my chest collapsed inward, the way my whole body seemed to tilt. He brushed it off, as if what he had stolen was meaningless, as if the memory attached to it had expired right alongside my grief. What he didn't understand was that it wasn't about money or a possession. It was about connection. Every morning since Frank passed, I wound that old watch by hand. It was a ritual. The small clicking sound reminded me that time still moved, that Frank's presence was woven into the rhythm of my days. And in one selfish act, my son severed that fragile thread, leaving me staring at an empty space where memory had once lived. The room around me seemed to shrink. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of dish soap, even the way the late afternoon light slanted across the counter, all of it became sharper, crueler, like the world itself was mocking me for being so easily discarded. His wife stood nearby, her voice smooth and practiced, telling me that I was clinging to the past, that I should let go. She spoke as though she knew my husband, as though she had any right to decide what his memory should mean to me. The condescension dripped heavier than the water still falling from my fingertips. In that moment, disbelief gave way to hurt so profound that I felt hollowed out. How could the people I had loved and raised, the ones I sacrificed everything for, treat me like this? Was my grief an inconvenience? Was my love just another resource to be mined until it ran dry? I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand answers. But instead, I stood there, rooted to the kitchen floor, tasting betrayal fully for the first time. It wasn't just about an heirloom. It was about being unseen, unheard, and unwanted in my own family. Later, when the door slammed behind them and silence filled the house once more, I realized this was not the first time they had chipped away at me. The watch was only the sharpest cut. The truth was that cracks had been forming for years, little moments I had pushed aside in the name of keeping peace. And now, with this fresh wound, those memories came flooding back, demanding that I face them. That night, sitting alone at the table Frank and I once shared with laughter and late-night coffee, I knew I could no longer ignore the pattern. This betrayal was not an isolated mistake. It was the culmination of something much larger. And to understand how I got here, I have to take you back to the years before, to the history of a family I thought I knew, and the sacrifices I made that led to this moment. I wasn't always this hollowed version of myself. My story began in quieter, simpler years, when love still felt like a solid foundation under my feet. I married Frank when I was just 21. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was more than enough. He worked long shifts at the mill, and I taught part-time at the local elementary school. Our lives were measured in small victories, paying off the old Chevy, planting a garden behind our first house, celebrating birthdays with store-bought cakes that never quite held their frosting. When our son, Daniel, was born, I remember thinking I'd never known a love so fierce. Nights blurred into mornings as I rocked him to sleep, whispering promises into his soft hair. I swore I would always protect him, always make sure he knew how deeply he was loved. Frank and I built our lives around that boy, working harder than we ever thought possible so he could have more than we did. There were lean years when money was short, but somehow we managed. I mended clothes instead of buying new ones, packed lunches from scraps, and smiled even when my heart ached with worry. Frank and I used to laugh about how we were raising a prince in a one-bathroom castle. And in some ways, we were. Daniel was our pride, our proof that all the sacrifices were worth it. Then came the day when life shifted. Frank fell ill, and the fight against time became one we couldn't win. I held his hand through endless hospital visits, through nights when the oxygen machine hummed louder than our own breathing. When he passed, I thought I'd broken for good. But Daniel still needed me, and I clung to that purpose like a lifeline. As the years passed, Daniel built a career, married, and started his own family. I was proud, so proud. But along with that pride came a distance I hadn't expected. His wife, Claire, arrived in our lives with a smile that never quite warmed me. I told myself it was my imagination, that she only needed time to settle into the family. But her words always carried a sharpness, like they were meant to remind me of my place, and it wasn't at the center anymore. I wanted harmony, so I bit my tongue. I convinced myself it was better to endure small slights than risk losing closeness with my son and grandson. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners, I made myself useful. I brought food. I babysat. I stayed quiet when Claire dismissed my suggestions or rolled her eyes when I talked too long about the past. But little by little, the warmth I had poured into this family seemed to fade. I could feel it in the way Daniel's hugs grew shorter, in the way my phone calls went unanswered for days, in the way my grandson was slowly shielded from me with excuses about schedules and busyness. Looking back now, I see the cracks were already forming long before the watch was taken. Subtle signs I ignored, hoping love alone could hold us together. I see now that those small moments were warnings, each one leading me to this place where betrayal finally showed its face. It's strange how betrayal never announces itself loudly at first. It creeps in quietly, disguised as concern, hidden in small comments, or buried in polite suggestions. Looking back, I can see how the warning signs had been there, but at the time, I brushed them aside, telling myself not to overthink. It started with money. Not large amounts at first, just little hints that I could help ease their burdens. Claire would sigh about bills piling up, about how Daniel's salary barely covered the mortgage, about how she wished their son could attend private school like the other kids in the neighborhood. I wanted to help. What mother wouldn't? So I wrote a check here, paid for a few school supplies there, convinced myself it was my way of giving back after everything Daniel had meant to me. But generosity has a way of shifting into expectation. Soon, it wasn't me offering, it was them suggesting. Claire would leave glossy brochures for new retirement communities on my counter when she stopped by, casually mentioning how nice it would be if I lived somewhere safe. Closer to them, Daniel, with that careful voice he uses when he doesn't want to upset me, began talking about simplifying my finances. How complicated it must be for me to keep track of things alone. At first, I thought it was kindness, but the more they pressed, the more it felt like they weren't helping me manage my life, they were preparing to take it from me. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon. I had gone to their house for dinner, something I always looked forward to because it meant time with my grandson. But that night, I found myself standing in the kitchen, carrying a plate of food while Claire and her friend whispered in the next room. They didn't see me standing by the doorway. I heard Claire laugh softly and say, "She won't last long in that big old house. Once she moves out, we can finally have some peace." My chest tightened. It wasn't just about convenience they were planning for my absence as if it were inevitable, as if I were already fading from their lives. From then on, I noticed things I had ignored before. The way Claire looked at my jewelry box when she thought I wasn't watching. The way Daniel rushed to change the subject when I mentioned updating my will, as though even the idea of me controlling my legacy was something they couldn't allow. I started to question myself. Was I imagining it? Was grief making me suspicious? Or had I simply been too blind for too long? Then came the humiliation. A neighbor stopped me outside the grocery store, congratulating me on Daniel and Claire's new investment. She said she'd heard from Claire that they were planning a big renovation on their house, thanks to my help. I stood there, stunned, clutching a bag of apples, nodding as though I understood. But I hadn't given them money for any renovation. The realization hit hard. They were already talking, as though my support was a given, as though my resources were theirs to use however they pleased. The anger that welled up inside me was fierce, but it was tangled with doubt. I told myself maybe Claire had been misunderstood. Maybe my neighbor got the details wrong. I wanted to believe it wasn't intentional. Yet deep down, I knew. These weren't accidents. These weren't misunderstandings. This was a plan unfolding slowly, carefully, under the guise of love and family. And then came the first undeniable proof. I was cleaning out a drawer in my study when I found a folder tucked neatly between old tax papers. It wasn't mine. Inside were copies of forms, legal documents with my name typed across the top, transfers of property, adjustments to accounts, even notes in Claire's handwriting about timing and simplifying ownership. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. They hadn't just thought about taking control. They were already preparing the paperwork. In that moment, the haze of self-doubt burned away, leaving only cold clarity. This wasn't about helping me. This wasn't about love. It was about control, about stripping me of the life I had built piece by piece, sacrifice by sacrifice. I sat there for a long time, staring at those papers, my pulse pounding in my ears. A part of me still wanted to cling to the belief that my son couldn't possibly be part of this, that maybe it was all Claire. But another part, the part that had weathered loss and disappointment before, whispered the truth. Daniel's silence was complicity. That night, lying awake in the dark, I realized I was standing at a crossroads. I could keep pretending, keep giving, keep swallowing my hurt. Or I could finally face what was happening and decide that I would not be erased so easily. The choice was becoming clear, and soon, I knew, I would be forced to act. The moment that broke me came not in a quiet discovery at home, but in the middle of a crowd, where humiliation settled on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. It was a Saturday evening, and Daniel and Claire had invited me to what they called a small family dinner. I told myself it would be a chance to reconnect, to see my grandson smile, and remind myself that family still meant something. But when I arrived, I realized quickly that this was no intimate gathering. Their dining room was filled with neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances, all of them dressed as though it were some grand occasion. The table gleamed under the chandelier. Silverware lined up like soldiers, crystal glasses catching the light. I placed the pie I had baked that morning, something simple, but made with care, at the edge of the table. It looked out of place beside the catered dishes with their glossy sauces and elaborate garnishes. I tried to keep to myself, sitting near the end of the table, listening quietly as conversation swirled around me. I watched my son laugh with his friends, and I felt proud, even if invisible. But then Claire's voice rose above the chatter. With a laugh that rang too rehearsed, she commented on how sweet it was that I still tried to be useful at these dinners. The words fell like shards of glass. For a moment, forks paused mid-air. A few guests chuckled nervously. My cheeks burned, and my hands shook under the table as I gripped my napkin, folding it over and over to steady myself. I forced a smile, swallowing the ache that climbed up my throat. I wanted to vanish, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. When dessert came, no one touched my pie. The guests reached instead for the glossy cakes from downtown, their laughter blending into a low hum that drowned me out. I sat silently, my palms damp against my knees, my heart pounding like a drum. By the time the night ended, I felt hollow. I stood in the entryway offering polite smiles, but inside, I was stripped bare. As I walked to my car in the cold night air, the truth settled heavy in my chest, in my own son's home. I had become an outsider. That drive home was when something inside me shifted. The betrayal of the watch, the whispers I had overheard, the documents I had found, they were no longer isolated wounds. They were pieces of a larger truth. And Claire's words that evening were the final cut. They didn't just want me out of their lives. They wanted everything I had worked for, everything Frank and I had built with our bare hands. The shock slowly hardened into something else: determination. For so long, I had told myself it was better to stay quiet, to keep the peace. But peace was no longer an option. I could not keep living as though I were disposable, as though the years of sacrifice and love meant nothing. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the old lamp that had lit countless late-night conversations with Frank. I imagined what he would say if he were here. I knew the answer. He would tell me to stop underestimating myself, to remember the strength it took to build a life out of nothing. I began to think of the skills I still had, the people who might help me. Over 3 decades as a teacher had taught me patience, strategy, and the ability to read people in ways they didn't realize. I had connections to an old student who had gone on to practice law, neighbors who respected me, friends who would stand by me if they knew what was happening. The plan wasn't fully formed yet, but the first spark was there. I would not allow them to take everything. I would gather my evidence. I would use my mind, and I would remind them that underestimating me was their greatest mistake. For the first time in months, I felt steady. I wasn't simply reacting anymore. I was preparing. And soon, I would make my move. The days that followed were filled with quiet calculation. I knew I couldn't confront Daniel and Claire directly. Not yet. They were too confident, too sure of their grip on me. If I wanted to win, I had to make them believe they were still in control while I quietly shifted the ground beneath their feet. The first step was reaching out to Marcus, a former student of mine who had gone on to become a lawyer. I still remembered him as a restless teenager, always pushing boundaries. But now, he had a sharp mind and a reputation for outmaneuvering opponents. Sitting across from him in his office, I explained everything I had uncovered. His brow furrowed deeper with every detail. But when I finished, he gave me a steady nod. He didn't see me as weak. He saw me as someone who had been wronged and was ready to fight back. That gave me strength. Together, we crafted a plan. Marcus prepared documents that looked exactly like what Claire had been pushing for papers, transferring certain assets and giving them more control. But hidden in the fine print were clauses that would expose their intentions, turning their signatures into admissions of fraud. The second step was choosing the stage. I invited them over one evening, pretending to be weary and overwhelmed, hinting that I was finally ready to make things easier by signing whatever they thought best. Claire's eyes lit up in that way I had come to dread, and Daniel looked relieved, as if the burden of me had finally been lifted. My heart raced as I set the papers on the table, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. Claire skimmed through the documents quickly, too eager to notice the traps. Daniel barely read them at all. When they pressed their pens to the page, I felt a chill run through me. That was the moment everything shifted, the moment their arrogance became their downfall. As they signed, I forced myself to stay calm, even as satisfaction pulsed through my chest. For months, I had been shrinking, letting them dictate the terms of my life. Now, with a few strokes of their pens, the balance of power tipped in my favor. The twist, though, came sooner than I expected. Claire, smug and triumphant, began talking openly about her plans, how she would finally convince me to move, how they could manage the property better than I ever could. She didn't realize that I had my phone recording the entire exchange, every word another nail sealing her fate. When the evening ended, they left my house believing they had won. But I sat there in the quiet, staring at the signed papers and listening to the recording. Knowing the truth, they had just walked straight into the very trap they had set for me. The fear I had carried for so long loosened its grip, replaced by something stronger: satisfaction, even triumph. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. But now, the pieces were in place, and for the first time, I wasn't just surviving their schemes. I was preparing to end them. What came next would decide everything. The days after that evening unfolded with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I handed the signed documents and the recording to Marcus, and he moved swiftly, ensuring everything was airtight. When the truth surfaced, when the manipulations and schemes were laid bare, Claire's confidence crumbled. Daniel, caught between denial and shame, could no longer hide behind excuses. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't the one shrinking, I was the one standing tall. Justice didn't come with fireworks or dramatic confrontations. It came in steady steps: lawyers' letters, official filings, the weight of evidence too strong to ignore. The property was secured, my finances safeguarded, and their plans dismantled before they could take root. Claire's reputation suffered, and Daniel, though spared the worst of the fallout, was forced to reckon with what he had allowed. For me, it wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming what was mine. Not just the tangible things, but my dignity, my worth, the reminder that I was not someone to be erased. I had spent too many nights doubting myself, convincing myself that silence was the noble choice. But silence only fed their confidence. Finding my voice again was the real victory. In the quiet moments afterward, I thought often about Frank. I imagined him smiling at me, not because I fought with bitterness, but because I fought with resilience. He always believed I was stronger than I gave myself credit for, and for the first time, I believed it too. This ordeal left scars. Yes, but it also gave me something unexpected: freedom. Freedom from the illusion that keeping peace at all costs is love. Freedom from the fear of standing alone. Freedom to shape the rest of my life on my own terms. I still love my son. That part of me will never change. But love does not mean surrendering my soul. It means setting boundaries, even when it hurts. It means teaching, even now, that trust must be earned, not taken for granted. As I share this, I want you to hear more than just a story of betrayal. I want you to hear a reminder you are not powerless. No matter how small others try to make you feel, no matter how invisible they want you to become, your strength is still there. Sometimes it just takes one breaking point to awaken it. So, if you've ever felt pushed aside, if you've ever questioned your worth, let my story remind you that you can reclaim it. You can stand tall again. And sometimes, the greatest justice is simply refusing to be diminished. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your own experiences in the comments. I believe every voice matters. And if you found strength here, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who might need the reminder. Together, we can keep building spaces where people are valued, respected, and never underestimated.